The morning sun cast long shadows through the grand windows of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform. He had served as a royal guard for 15 years, but today felt different. Something was stirring in the palace corridors, whispers among the staff that made his stomach twist with unease. James had been assigned to patrol the private wing where Queen Camilla often held her personal meetings. It was supposed to be a routine morning, but as he walked the marble hallways, he noticed unusual activity. Several staff members were being dismissed early from their duties, and certain areas were being cleared without explanation. As he approached the Queen's private study, he heard voices coming from within. This wasn't unusual, as Camilla often met with advisors and family members. However, the tone of the conversation made him pause. There was tension in the air, sharp words being exchanged that seemed far from the usual royal protocols. James positioned himself at his designated post outside the heavy oak doors. His training had taught him to remain focused and alert, but he couldn't help noticing how the conversation inside seemed to grow more heated by the minute. The voices belonged to Queen Camilla and someone else, someone whose voice he recognized but couldn't immediately place. Through years of service, James had developed an acute sense for trouble. He had seen royal family disputes before, witnessed moments of tension that never made it to the public eye. But this felt different. The urgency in their voices, the way they kept lowering their tones as if afraid of being overheard, sent warning signals through his mind. The palace seemed unusually quiet that morning. Normally there would be bustling activity, staff members moving between rooms, the sound of preparations for daily royal duties. Instead, an eerie stillness had settled over the building as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. James checked his watch. It was nearly 10 o'clock and the meeting had been going on for over an hour. Royal meetings typically followed strict schedules with precise timing for each appointment. The fact that this conversation was extending far beyond normal parameters suggested something serious was being discussed. As he stood at attention, James began to piece together fragments of what he was hearing. Words like dangerous, secret, and consequences drifted through the thick doors. His military training had taught him to stay focused on his duties. But his instincts as a protector of the royal family made him increasingly concerned about what was unfolding behind those doors. The other voice in the room became clearer now, and James realized with shock that it belonged to Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage. The conversation between mother and son was clearly not a casual family chat. There was desperation in Tom's voice, pleading mixed with anger that suggested whatever they were discussing had serious implications for the royal family. James had always prided himself on his discretion and professionalism. He had never once violated the trust placed in him by the royal household. But as the conversation continued, he found himself in an impossible position. His duty was to protect the royal family. But how could he do that if he didn't understand the nature of the threat they might be facing? The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him as he stood in the hallway, torn between his sworn oath of loyalty and his growing concern that something was terribly wrong. Whatever was happening in that room, James sensed it would change everything he thought he knew about the royal family he had devoted his life to serving. James pressed his ear slightly closer to the door, abandoning his usual strict posture. What he heard next made his blood run cold. Tom's voice was shaking as he spoke about documents that could destroy the monarchy's reputation forever. The desperation in his tone suggested he was in serious trouble, possibly being blackmailed or threatened by unknown forces. Camilla's response was sharp and calculated. She spoke about covering up something that had happened years ago, before she became queen. James caught fragments about payments, silenced witnesses, and buried investigations. The conversation revealed a web of secrets that went far deeper than any tabloid scandal he had ever heard whispered about in the palace corridors. Tom mentioned a journalist who had been getting too close to the truth. He explained how this person had somehow obtained copies of financial records and private communications that could expose everything. The panic in his voice was evident, as he described how the journalist had been asking questions about offshore accounts and suspicious transactions that occurred during the early days of Camilla's relationship with King Charles. The Queen's tone shifted from anger to cold determination. She began outlining a plan that made James's hands tremble as he listened. She spoke about using royal influence to discredit the journalist, about calling in favors from powerful media owners, and about ensuring that certain evidence would never see the light of day. Her words revealed a side of the monarchy that the public never saw, a ruthless machine willing to do whatever it took to protect itself. James heard Tom expressing doubts about their approach. He questioned whether they were going too far, whether the risks of their cover-up might be greater than simply allowing the truth to come out. But Camilla cut him off sharply, reminding him that his own reputation and future were at stake. She made it clear that if the scandal broke, it wouldn't just damage her. It would destroy his chances of maintaining his current lifestyle and social standing. The conversation took an even darker turn when Camilla mentioned specific individuals who needed to be handled. James realized with horror that she was talking about intimidating or silencing people who might have knowledge of whatever they were trying to hide. The casual way she discussed these actions suggested this wasn't the first time such measures had been taken to protect royal secrets. Tom's voice became more agitated as he described the mounting pressure he was under. Someone had been following him. His phone calls were being monitored, and he suspected that dangerous people were involved in the attempt to expose their secret. He begged his mother to find a different solution, one that didn't involve potentially putting innocent people at risk. But Camilla remained unmoved by her son's concerns. She spoke about the greater good of the monarchy, about protecting an institution that was bigger than any individual. Her words revealed a woman who had become completely consumed by power and the need to maintain her position at any cost. James began to understand that whatever secret they were protecting, it was significant enough to potentially bring down the entire royal establishment. As the conversation continued, James learned that the secret involved financial corruption that had occurred during crucial negotiations for royal estates and investments. Money had been diverted, favors had been traded, and proper procedures had been deliberately bypassed. The amounts involved were staggering, enough to fund small countries, and the implications reached into the highest levels of government and international finance. The most shocking revelation came when Tom mentioned that King Charles might not be fully aware of the extent of what had been done in his name. Camilla had apparently taken actions and made decisions that could compromise the crown, without the king's complete knowledge or consent. This meant that even the reigning monarch could become a victim of the scandal if the truth emerged. James realized he was witnessing a conversation that could reshape British history. The weight of what he was hearing pressed down on him like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe as he stood frozen in the hallway, unable to move away from the door, but terrified of what he might hear next. The conversation inside the room suddenly stopped, and James heard footsteps moving toward the door. Panic shot through him as he quickly stepped back into his proper position, hoping his face didn't reveal the shock and confusion swirling in his mind. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain anyone nearby would hear it echoing through the marble hallway. The door handle turned slowly, and Tom Parker Bowles emerged first, his face pale and drawn with stress. He glanced at James briefly, and for a moment their eyes met. James saw something in Tom's expression that chilled him to the bone, a mixture of fear, guilt, and desperation that suggested the man was trapped in a situation far beyond his control. Camilla appeared in the doorway moments later, her composure perfectly intact despite the intense conversation that had just taken place. She looked every inch the queen, her bearing regal and confident, but James noticed something different in her eyes. There was a hardness there that he had never seen before, a calculating coldness that made him question everything he thought he knew about the woman he was sworn to protect. She nodded curtly at James as she passed, a gesture that would normally be routine and meaningless, but today something in her glance made him feel as though she was studying him, measuring whether he posed any threat to whatever plan she had been discussing with her son. The feeling was so intense that James had to resist the urge to look away. Tom lingered for a moment after his mother had walked away, and James could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. The man looked as though he wanted to say something, perhaps to warn someone or ask for help, but ultimately he remained silent and followed Camilla down the corridor toward the main palace areas. Alone again in the hallway, James tried to process what he had witnessed. His mind raced through the implications of the conversation, the potential consequences for the monarchy, and most importantly, his own responsibility in the situation. As a royal guard, he had sworn oaths of loyalty and discretion, but he had also sworn to protect the royal family from all threats, including threats that might come from within their own ranks. The weight of his dilemma was crushing. If he reported what he had heard, he would be breaking his vow of discretion and potentially destroying the reputation of the institution he had dedicated his life to serving. But if he remained silent, he might be allowing a cover-up that could eventually cause even greater damage to the monarchy and potentially put innocent people at risk. James began to consider who he could trust with this information. His immediate superiors were loyal to the royal family above all else, and he suspected they would prioritize protecting the institution over pursuing justice. The thought of going to outside authorities filled him with dread, as it would mean betraying everything he had been trained to uphold. As he stood in the empty hallway, James realized that other staff members might have noticed the unusual activity that morning. The early dismissals, the cleared corridors, the extended private meeting. All of these things could have attracted attention from people who, like him, were trained to notice when things were out of the ordinary. His thoughts turned to Sarah Chen, a fellow security officer who had been working at the palace for almost as long as he had. Sarah was known for her integrity, and had always been someone James could trust with sensitive information. He wondered if she had noticed anything unusual that morning, or if she might be able to help him figure out the right course of action. The more James thought about the conversation he had overheard, the more convinced he became that the situation was far more dangerous than just a family dispute or minor scandal. The mention of financial corruption, intimidation tactics, and cover-ups suggested that powerful and potentially dangerous people were involved in whatever secret Camilla and Tom were trying to protect. He also began to worry about his own safety. If Camilla suspected that he had overheard their conversation, she might take action to ensure his silence. The casual way she had discussed silencing others made him realize that his position as a loyal guard might not protect him if he was seen as a threat to their plans. The very institution he had sworn to serve might become the source of danger to his own life and livelihood. Later that afternoon, James found Sarah Chen in the security office reviewing the daily patrol schedules. Her concentration was intense as she studied the assignments, but she looked up when he entered the room. Something in his expression must have alarmed her because she immediately set down her papers and gestured for him to close the door behind him. James had known Sarah for over a decade, and they had developed the kind of professional trust that comes from years of working together in high-pressure situations. She was one of the few people in the palace who he believed would prioritize doing the right thing over protecting institutional interests, even when those two things came into conflict. Without revealing specific details, James began to probe whether Sarah had noticed anything unusual that morning. He mentioned the early staff dismissals and the cleared corridors, watching her reaction carefully. Sarah's expression grew serious as she confirmed that she too had noticed the strange atmosphere in the palace that day. Sarah revealed that she had been approached by her supervisor and told to avoid certain areas of the palace during the morning hours. No explanation had been given, which was highly unusual since security protocols typically required detailed briefings about any changes to their normal routines. The fact that multiple guards had been redirected without explanation suggested that someone with significant authority wanted to ensure privacy for whatever was happening. As they talked, James realized that Sarah had also been feeling uneasy about recent events in the palace. She mentioned subtle changes in behavior among senior staff members, increased private meetings, and a general sense of tension that seemed to be building over the past several weeks. Her observations confirmed that whatever he had overheard was part of a larger pattern of secretive activity. James made a careful decision to share some of what he had heard, though he kept the most shocking details to himself for the moment. He told Sarah about the conversation between Camilla and Tom, focusing on the mentions of financial irregularities and attempts to silence journalists. Sarah's reaction was immediate and serious. She understood the implications of such accusations and the potential damage they could cause. Sarah shared information that made James's blood run cold. She had recently noticed unusual activity in the palace's communication systems, with certain phone lines being monitored and email accounts being accessed by people who normally wouldn't have such privileges. This suggested that the cover-up James had heard discussed was already being implemented through systematic surveillance and information control. The two guards began to piece together a timeline of events that painted a disturbing picture. Over the past month, several staff members had been transferred to different positions without explanation. A prominent royal biographer had suddenly canceled a planned book project, and at least 2 journalists had stopped pursuing stories they had been actively investigating related to royal finances. Sarah revealed that she had been keeping informal notes about these unusual occurrences, partly out of professional habit, and partly because her instincts told her that something significant was happening. Her documentation provided crucial context for understanding the scope and systematic nature of the cover-up that James had overheard being planned. As they discussed their options, both guards realized they were facing an unprecedented situation. Their loyalty to the royal family was absolute, but the evidence suggested that the institution they served was being used to cover up serious wrongdoing. The question was whether their duty lay in protecting the monarchy's reputation or in ensuring that justice was served, even if it meant exposing uncomfortable truths. James and Sarah agreed that they needed more information before taking any action. They decided to quietly monitor the situation over the next few days, documenting any further unusual activity and trying to gather additional evidence that might help them understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. The weight of their decision was enormous. Both guards understood that if they were discovered investigating activities within the royal household, their careers would be over and they might face serious legal consequences. But they also recognized that their unique positions gave them access to information that might never be available to outside investigators, making them possibly the only people capable of uncovering the truth. As they prepared to leave the security office, Sarah made a suggestion that surprised James. She proposed that they should consider documenting everything they discovered and creating a secure record that could be preserved regardless of what happened to them personally. The idea of creating evidence that could survive even if they were silenced showed how seriously she was taking the potential dangers they faced. Over the next 3 days, James and Sarah implemented a careful surveillance operation within the palace walls. They used their legitimate security duties as cover while gathering information about the suspicious activities they had identified. What they discovered exceeded their worst fears about the scope of the corruption they were investigating. James managed to access visitor logs that revealed a pattern of meetings between Camilla and individuals with connections to offshore banking and international finance. These weren't the typical advisory meetings that would be expected for a member of the royal family, but rather clandestine sessions with people whose backgrounds suggested involvement in money laundering and tax avoidance schemes. Sarah discovered that palace communication records showed extensive contact between Tom Parker Bowles and a private security firm known for handling discrete problems for wealthy clients. The timing of these contacts coincided perfectly with the periods when journalists and investigators had suddenly abandoned their research into royal financial affairs, suggesting that intimidation tactics were indeed being employed. Their investigation revealed that the financial corruption went back nearly 15 years, to the period when Camilla was establishing her position within the royal family. Millions of pounds had been diverted from royal estate transactions. Charitable funds had been misappropriated, and investment decisions had been made that primarily benefited private accounts controlled by Camilla and her associates rather than the crown estate. The most shocking discovery came when Sarah found evidence that suggested King Charles had been systematically deceived about the true nature of many financial decisions made in his name. Documents showed that Camilla had been presenting false information to the king, using her influence to get his approval for transactions that he didn't fully understand. This meant that the reigning monarch had unknowingly become complicit in activities that violated both royal protocols and British law. James uncovered communications that revealed the identity of the journalist who had been threatening to expose the corruption. Victoria Sterling was an investigative reporter with a reputation for uncovering financial crimes among the wealthy and powerful. Her research had apparently come very close to exposing the full extent of the royal financial scandal, which explained the desperation in the conversation James had overheard. The evidence showed that Victoria Sterling had been receiving anonymous tips from someone inside the royal household, someone who had access to financial records and private communications. This insider had been feeding her information for months, gradually building a case that could potentially bring down the monarchy. The revelation that there was another palace insider involved in exposing the truth gave James and Sarah hope that they weren't alone in their concerns. However, their investigation also revealed the serious dangers they were facing. Sarah discovered that the private security firm employed by Tom Parker Bowles had been conducting surveillance on palace staff, looking for potential security leaks. Several staff members had been subjected to intrusive background checks. Their personal communications had been monitored, and their family members had been investigated as potential leverage points. James learned that Victoria Sterling had recently gone into hiding after receiving direct threats against her safety. Her research materials had been stolen from her office, her computer had been hacked, and she had been warned that continuing her investigation would result in serious consequences for both her career and her personal well-being. The systematic nature of the intimidation campaign showed how far Camilla and her associates were willing to go to protect their secrets. As James and Sarah compiled their evidence, they realized that they were documenting not just financial corruption, but a comprehensive conspiracy that involved multiple criminal activities. The cover-up included fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, intimidation, and possibly even blackmail. The scope of the crimes was so extensive that exposing them would likely result in criminal charges against numerous individuals, including members of the royal family. The two guards also discovered that they weren't the only palace employees who had noticed suspicious activities. Several other staff members had been quietly expressing concerns about unusual events, unexplained policy changes, and the general atmosphere of secrecy that had developed within the royal household. This suggested that their investigation might have broader support among palace staff who were troubled by what they were witnessing. But their research also revealed how dangerous their position had become. The evidence showed that other palace employees who had asked too many questions or expressed concerns about unusual activities had been transferred, demoted, or dismissed under various pretexts. The pattern suggested that Camilla and her associates had been systematically removing potential threats to their operations, which meant that James and Sarah were likely already under suspicion. The weight of their discoveries forced them to make a crucial decision about how to proceed. They had enough evidence to support serious criminal investigations, but they also knew that attempting to expose the truth would put their own lives at risk and could potentially destroy the institution they had devoted their careers to serving. The decision about what to do with their evidence came to a head when James discovered that he and Sarah were being actively investigated by the private security firm. Hidden cameras had been installed near their workstations, their personal communications were being monitored, and their off-duty activities were being tracked. The realization that they had become targets made it clear that time was running out for them to act. Sarah made contact with Victoria Sterling through a secure communication channel, using her knowledge of palace security systems to avoid detection. The journalist was initially suspicious, having been betrayed by false sources before, but the specific details that Sarah could provide convinced her that the contact was genuine. Victoria agreed to meet with them, but only under carefully controlled conditions that would protect all of their identities. The meeting took place in a small cafe outside London, chosen specifically because it had no security cameras and was unlikely to be under surveillance. Victoria Sterling proved to be a sharp, determined woman who had been investigating royal financial irregularities for over 2 years. Her research had been thorough and systematic, but she had been missing key pieces of evidence that could transform her suspicions into a bulletproof case. James and Sarah provided Victoria with copies of the documents they had gathered, including financial records, communication logs, and evidence of the intimidation campaign that had been launched against various individuals. Victoria's reaction confirmed their worst fears about the scope of the corruption, she explained, that the evidence they had provided filled crucial gaps in her investigation and proved connections she had only suspected. Before, Victoria revealed that she had been working with law enforcement agencies in multiple countries, as the financial corruption involved international money laundering and tax evasion schemes that crossed national boundaries. The evidence from James and Sarah would enable coordinated investigations that could freeze assets, prevent the destruction of additional evidence, and potentially lead to arrests of the key figures involved in the conspiracy. However, Victoria also warned them about the extreme dangers they would face once their cooperation with her investigation became known. The private security firm employed by Tom Parker Bowles had connections to organized crime and had previously been involved in cases where witnesses and investigators had suffered serious harm. She strongly advised James and Sarah to prepare for the possibility that they might need to enter protective custody or even relocate permanently for their own safety. The three of them worked together to develop a plan that would maximize the chances of the investigation succeeding while providing some protection for James and Sarah. Victoria would coordinate with international law enforcement to ensure that multiple agencies moved simultaneously, preventing Camilla and her associates from destroying evidence or fleeing to countries without extradition treaties. James and Sarah would remain in their positions for a few more days, continuing to gather evidence while being extremely careful not to arouse suspicion. They would also identify other palace staff members who might be willing to cooperate with the investigation, potentially providing additional witnesses and evidence that could strengthen the case against the conspirators. Victoria explained that the investigation would likely become public within a week, as law enforcement agencies would need to move quickly once they had the evidence in hand. The revelation of widespread corruption within the royal family would create a media firestorm and potentially trigger a constitutional crisis, as questions would arise about the monarchy's ability to continue functioning under such circumstances. The journalist also revealed that James and Sarah weren't the only palace insiders who had been providing her with information. She had been receiving tips from multiple sources within the royal household, suggesting that opposition to Camilla's activities was more widespread than they had realized. This knowledge gave them hope that they wouldn't be completely isolated when the investigation became public. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Victoria made arrangements for secure communication channels that would allow James and Sarah to continue providing information while minimizing the risk of detection. She also gave them contact information for legal advocates who specialized in protecting whistleblowers, recognizing that they would likely need professional support to navigate the legal and personal challenges they would face. The drive back to London was tense and silent as James and Sarah contemplated what they had set in motion. They understood that their lives would never be the same, regardless of how the investigation played out. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, choosing justice over institutional loyalty and personal safety. The weight of their decision was enormous, but both guards felt a sense of relief that they were finally taking action against the corruption they had discovered. By the time they returned to the palace, both James and Sarah had accepted that they were no longer just royal guards protecting an institution they respected. They had become active participants in an investigation that could reshape British society and determine whether the monarchy could survive the revelation of the secrets it had been hiding. The final phase of the investigation unfolded with dramatic speed that caught even James and Sarah off guard. Within 72 hours of their meeting with Victoria Sterling, international law enforcement agencies launched coordinated raids in London, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands, freezing assets worth hundreds of millions of pounds and seizing documents that provided irrefutable proof of the financial conspiracy. James was on duty in the palace when the first wave of arrests began. He watched through the windows as unmarked vehicles surrounded the building, and teams of investigators, accompanied by high-ranking police officials, entered through the main gates. The sight was both terrifying and surreal, while the institution he had sworn to protect was being invaded by law enforcement agencies acting on evidence he had helped provide. Camilla was arrested in her private study, the same room where James had first overheard the conversation that started his investigation. Witnesses later described her as maintaining her composure throughout the arrest, refusing to answer questions and demanding to speak with her legal representatives. Tom Parker Bowles was arrested simultaneously at his London residence, along with several associates who had been involved in managing the offshore accounts and money laundering operations. The arrests sent shockwaves throughout the palace and the broader British establishment. Staff members were questioned extensively as investigators worked to understand the full scope of the corruption and identify all individuals who had been involved in either the criminal activities or the subsequent cover-up attempts. James and Sarah were among the first to be interviewed, but their cooperation with the investigation was kept confidential to protect them from potential retaliation. King Charles was not arrested, but he was questioned at length about his knowledge of the financial irregularities that had been conducted in his name. The evidence showed that while he had been deliberately deceived about many transactions, his failure to implement proper oversight systems had enabled the corruption to continue for years. The constitutional implications of the king's involvement, however unwitting, created unprecedented legal and political challenges. The investigation revealed that the financial conspiracy had been even more extensive than James and Sarah had initially discovered. Beyond the money laundering and tax evasion, evidence emerged of arms dealing, illegal political contributions, and connections to international organized crime syndicates. The royal family's reputation had been used to legitimize criminal enterprises that spanned multiple continents and involved billions of pounds in illegal transactions. Victoria Sterling's reporting on the scandal earned her international recognition and numerous journalism awards, but she never forgot the courage shown by James and Sarah in coming forward with evidence that made the investigation possible. In her articles, she carefully protected their identities while highlighting the important role that whistleblowers play in exposing corruption among the powerful. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy, involving multiple jurisdictions and requiring coordination between law enforcement agencies in dozens of countries. Camilla was ultimately convicted on charges including money laundering, tax evasion, fraud, and conspiracy, receiving a substantial prison sentence that effectively ended her role in public life. Tom Parker Bowles and several associates also received significant prison terms for their roles in the criminal enterprise. For James and Sarah, the aftermath of the investigation was bittersweet. Their careers as royal guards ended, as the institutional changes that followed the scandal made it impossible for them to continue in their previous roles. However, both found new positions in law enforcement agencies that valued their integrity and investigative skills. They also received protection and support from witness protection programs that helped them rebuild their lives away from the threats they had faced. The monarchy itself survived the scandal, but underwent fundamental reforms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. New oversight systems were implemented, financial transparency requirements were strengthened, and independent monitoring bodies were established to ensure that royal resources could never again be misused on such a massive scale. King Charles remained on the throne, but his reign was forever marked by the revelation that criminal activities had been conducted in his name, without his knowledge. The scandal forced a broader conversation about the role of the monarchy in modern British society, and the need for greater accountability and transparency in all royal activities. Years later, James often reflected on the moment when he first heard that conversation through the study door. The decision to listen, to investigate, and ultimately to act had changed not only his own life but the course of British history. The weight of that responsibility had been enormous, but he never regretted choosing truth and justice over institutional loyalty and personal safety. The scandal had shaken the palace to its foundations, but it had also proven that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable when ordinary people found the courage to do what was right.